Imagine the kitchen at first light. Ash settled on the hearth. A bell in the yard giving its single, thin peal. For 5 months, the pantry ledger showed extra salt and cloth scraps that no one explained. You notice the knife stones always left wet. The rags spoiled longer than meat. Then, a night comes when the woman who ran the house never speaks again. This is the unflinching story of Cato Mayfield, North Carolina, 1719. Before we dive in, please subscribe if you like my exclusive investigation. The box surfaced in Raleigh on June 12, 2023, when a run of colonial claims records was declassified and handed from a climate-controlled stack to a quiet reading room. Inside lay a stitched folio of estate papers from the lower Cape Fear, a thin iron key tied to the cord, and a pressed magnolia petal foxed dark at its veins. The ledger pages smelled faintly of smoke. On one sheet, a housekeeper's inventory listed kitchen rags, salt, and oil stones, items annotated in a careful hand for 5 months running, then crossed through in a shake that broke the ink. 2 pages later, a sheriff's inquest summarized a mistress in bed, a window raised for air, a candle guttered on a washstand, and silence where there should have been a scream. The image holds, the key, the petal, the burnt-smelling book. It foreshadows a night when a small tool and a long memory bent the balance of a house. The Whitfield estate sat where the Cape Fear bent slow past cypress stands and pepper bark in damp heat that made the nights feel heavy even under a new moon. Tobacco rose, pushed out from the big house like combed hair. On the riverbank, tar kilns smoked steady when the wind went slack, and hogsheads waited under a hoist beside the landing where shallow craft came on the tide. The enslaved quarter stood beyond a fig tree whose smooth bark children used to practice knife work on green fruit. The tree drew wasps, and the wasps drew swallows, and the swallows drew cats that watched with half-closed eyes from the fence posts. A chapel bell rescued from a wrecked sloop hung in the yard as a signal device. The bell marked waking, meals, and curfew. It marked punishment days when the overseer wanted all eyes turned to the same place. Surveillance was not merely line of sight. It lived in habit. Who crossed thresholds and when, which chores pulled a body toward the kitchens, who counted tools at dusk, who logged rations in the ledger, which dogs roamed loose on the edge of the quarter. The overseer's whistle could pull a man from the smokehouse with a single note. A neighbor's skiff on the river could drift close enough to hear a quarrel through shutters. Even the river worked like a watcher, reflecting lanterns as thin columns of shaking light. Cato Mayfield rose before the bell. He worked the tar pits when ordered and the smokehouse when trusted, but his best use to the house lay on an edge between heat and edge, whetting the draw knives that shaved staves for barrels, truing hoop ends, and keeping the kitchen blades from chattering through sinew. He had a quiet way of handling steel that made others step clear. He would oil the stones with a mixture boiled from hog fat and ash water, wipe the residue on cloth, and hang the cloth to dry along a beam above the hearth. He counted not by marks on paper, but by the way the rags weighed his hand when folded, by the sound a knife made when it came flat to the stone. His private rituals were slight and private because anything larger risked notice. When he passed the fig tree in the evening, he touched a knot at hip height, a habit that made children laugh when they noticed and mimic him until they forgot. In the smokehouse, he would pull breath through his nose twice before striking a tinder to check for air that could flash. On nights when the wind turned from the swamp and brought the sweet rotting scent of deadfall, he would stand outside the quarter and map the yard by sound. The chain at the kennel, the pop of sap at the kiln, the river knocking a skiff plank to plank. Cato's wound was not one thing, but a knot of things pulled tight by a single instrument. The mistress, Eleanor Whitfield, kept an iron bit for punishment. a hinged mouthpiece mounted to a bridle that had been fashioned in a Wilmington smithy. The device had been used in the yard and in the kitchen to enforce silence when she judged insolence. Cato's partner, Ruth, had been forced to wear it after she argued against a second day at the kiln in heat that made the air shimmer. She returned to the quarter with dried blood at the corners of her mouth and a smell of rust that did not leave her breath. In the weeks after, an infection took hold that the quarter midwife could not turn. Ruth died before the first cold snap, her lips chapped and cracked where iron had taught the lesson the mistress favored. From then on, Cato's work with knives changed. He still drew edges the way a cooper draws staves, but he also counted days by the bell and rags by the way they took oil, adding a layer of purpose no one saw. The antagonist who ruled the ledgers was the mistress herself. Eleanor Whitfield's order sprang from fear that rang like glass. She watched the kitchen as if it were a stage for betrayal. She tracked salt and vinegar and cloth as if the ledger could bind bodies to labor. She demanded silence to keep her reflection intact. Her weakness lay in her own body, laudanum at night for nerves, wine before it to smooth the climb to sleep, and a need for air that made her lift the sash in the worst heat. On those nights, the drape moved like a slow lung. Colonel Thomas Whitfield served as the theoretical head of the house and practical head of its commerce. He moved along the river to trade tar, pitch, and tobacco notes, and he staked credit on shipments as if tides and markets obeyed him. He enjoyed militia dinners and the way a saber on a table spoke of the order he believed he commanded. His predictable absence came when hogsheads rolled to the landing under a moonless sky before a tide that ran strong. He would ride downriver to meet a buyer, or ride upriver to threaten one, leaving the yard to habit and the overseer's hand. Garrick Howe, the overseer, held his control like a man grips the middle of a stick to feel both the weight and balance. He kept the dogs lean enough to beg and eager enough to run. He drank on market evenings, and the cards took his focus in a way that made his whistle late and his lantern swing low. His keyring clinked like a warning bell when he moved. He complained about the chapel bell as if it mocked him by answering at its own pace when he struck it. Other figures played smaller roles. A neighbor who poached fish at the bend set nets at night and pretended not to see what he saw. A house girl named Dinah moved through rooms like a breath, learning where bodies set cups down and which drawers stuck in damp weather. The blacksmith in town swapped a story once about a chain mended in a hurry and billed to the estate. The river held all their reflections a second longer than it needed to. Artifacts that would matter later already existed in plain sight. A decoy key ring hung on a nail just inside the pantry door. 2 brass keys that looked important and were not. The rusted lock on the smokehouse would open if a blade held its tongue just right. The chapel bell's clapper had a hairline crack that made it ring flat on damp mornings. In the ledger, a page from Midsummer bore a brown stain that had spread like a flower pressed in paper, likely sap from a tar stick that someone set down without thinking. Under the fig tree, a shallow bowl of earth showed where a child had dug and filled, a habit that patterned the ground like quiet practice. The weather across late summer carried a monotone pressure punctuated by storms. When storms passed, the night cooled for a breath before the air grew close again. That close air kept scents low. It carried pig fat, ash, laudanum, vinegar, and the sweet cut of fig. It carried the river's rot and the rose oil that the mistress dabbed at her wrist. In those weeks, a pattern formed in the pantry marks. Rags up, oil up, salt up by small, regular measures that could pass under anyone's eye except the eye of a person who had begun to measure time by materials instead of days. Cato's skills drove a plan that did not look like a plan at first. The knives he tended moved through the kitchen without comment. He sharpened the paring blade until it would shave hair without tugging, then returned it to its place as if care alone explained it. He broke in a whetstone until it sang clear at the right pressure, then left it where it lived. In the smokehouse, he learned the lock's hitch the way a fiddler learns a tune. He watched the dogs watch him until their watching grew dull because nothing ever came of it. He charted the overseer's card nights by the way the man's lantern swung. A wider arc on nights when he drank more, a lower roll when he lost. The motive hardened around the iron bit, which sat on a shelf wrapped in cloth like a holy thing. The mistress kept it clean. The iron had been blued once and rubbed to a satiny sheen by fingers that never had to clamp it down. It represented a set of beliefs about bodies and ownership and sound. The device taught a lesson that no one forgot, not even the person who gave the order to use it. It was not an accident that the pantry ledger's odd pattern started the week the midwife wrapped Ruth's body for burial. Ticking signals gathered from different corners of the property. The first came from the river, a buyer due after the next dark moon, a shipment that would pull the master away. The second came from the kiln, a run of tar peaking in late heat, which meant longer attention around fire and less around the house. The third came from the chapel bell itself, a crack lengthening, a pitch lowering, as if the metal had begun to count down in its own language. And there was a private metronome only one person heard, the scrape of a paring knife on stone, a rhythm practiced until the body could find it in any room without looking. When the day grew near, the routine carried the house forward on rails. The neighbor set nets, the overseer lost coins. The mistress opened the sash because the heat pressed her like a hand. In the pantry, the decoy ring stayed quiet while the real keys weighed the overseer's belt. In the ledger, the oil and rag entries ended suddenly. A line crossed through a word with more force than the paper could handle. Evening came with a storm that climbed the river in a low sheet and broke into a drift of fine rain. The bell clanged once in a damp note, and then again, because the overseer enjoyed the sound of his own authority. The dogs barked each other into silence. In the quarter, the children listened for the third peal that meant the night watch had started, the time when lanterns dimmed and windows unlatched for air. When that third note finally came, flat, damp, inevitable, the tick turned to tock. The house had entered the hour from which it would not easily come back. Rain loosened into a mist that silvered the yard and softened edges so that fences looked like brush strokes, and the fig leaves shone as if varnished. The chapel bell answered the overseer with that damp, flattened note. Habit folded the house into predictable angles. The mistress in her chamber with the sash raised for air. The laudanum bottle drawn down to its familiar measure. The washstand candle trimmed to a short wick. The iron bit on its shelf wrapped in a cloth that had once been white. In the quarter, bodies settled. Then a quiet rearrangement began that did not show on paper and did not belong to the bell. Cato moved first not toward the house but toward the smokehouse, because the smokehouse held three things he needed: grease, cloth, and the lock's small weakness. He palmed the paring blade wrapped in a rag that carried the clean, faint rankness of ash and fat, then slipped through the drip of the smokehouse eaves into the dark that smelled of salt, hickory, and sweetness left behind in cured meat. The lock gave to the language his blade spoke to its tongue. Inside, he lifted a crock lid and skimmed a thumb of lard into a strip of cloth. He tied the rag to a length of hemp and dragged it along the ground from the kennel outward, drawing a trail that would put the dogs' noses in the wrong place at the right time. On the way back, he dusted his own prints with ash, using the fallen gray as if it were another kind of fabric. Objective achieved, the dogs would find more interest at the yard edge than at the house. Set in that same breath, the second part belonged to others. An old man named Isaac took a place where the quarter path bent behind the storehouse, holding a stick as if he were only resting. Two children, who never could sleep when the air pressed them flat, counted silent strokes of the cracked bell's echo, ears trained to the overseer's patterns. Dinah passed along the gallery with a ewer at the precise time she always did, her footfall neither light nor heavy, a sound no one noticed because it never changed, and because she did not change the sound, no one saw her hand ease the decoy keyring off its nail in the pantry and hang it on a hook near the outer door where Garrick Howe liked to toss his coat. These movements were not orders. They were a kind of weather Cato could rely on. Currents in rooms, predictabilities in people who had learned not to make surprises. The yard held steady long enough to give the plan a frame. Then the first countermove showed its shape. The rain thinned faster than the night wanted, and a seam opened in the clouds so that a little white light cupped the yard with a cold hand. The dogs, restless under their shed roof, caught the change and stirred before the false trail had matured. Cato adjusted without thinking. He dragged the grease rag farther, past the fig tree and along the fence to the tar yard where pitch held, sensed the way paper holds ink. He sank the rag into a curl of shavings until the smell rose thick enough to turn a nose in circles. When he let the rope fall away, it vanished into blackness that returned to looking exactly like itself. Objective revised. Keep noses busy in a place no person would search first. Back at the kitchen threshold, he paused long enough to hear the house breathe. A window cord sighed against its pulley. Floorboards took and gave the weight upstairs. From the pantry, a faint metallic chime marked the overseer's keys where he had laid them, a sound that would matter more in a later minute than it did now. Cato lifted the paring blade into his palm, bone handle cupped to skin, edge sheathed in the last of the rag so that it would not flash if moonlight found it. He pressed his thumb against the wetted line, feeling the hesitant bite he had worked for over weeks, that imperfect sharpness a cook prefers for fruit and a careful hand prefers for skin because it does not skate. The second set piece began inside the kitchen, a room organized by heat and habit. Ash spread thin as talc on the hearth bricks. The ledger lay square on a shelf above the flour tins, its edges browned by a coal once set too close. Cato passed without touching it. He lifted from a peg the single coarse towel that never left the kitchen because it was too worn for the mistress's bath and too useful for wiping blade oil. He folded it twice so that it sat like a particular weight in his hand. He moved through the pantry where the decoy keys gleamed dully in their new place, then paused at the stair bottom to listen for the overseer's swing. The lantern outside traced its slow arc, lazy and low, the signature of a man who had lost coins at cards and taken comfort in a bottle not made for comfort. On the landing, air cooled by the open sash brought up a breath of night garden. Crushed fig leaf, wet wood, and the rose oil the mistress favored, faint but insistent. The chamber door stood on its latch. Inside, the washstand candle guttered to a saucer of wax. The wick's tiny ember made a red eye that pulsed with each draft. The bed curtains hung still, a soft square of darker dark. The iron bit kept vigil on its shelf, wrapped and swaddled, a ritual object of a private faith. Cato set the folded towel on the mattress edge beside a small spill of rose scent where the mistress's wrist had rested. He kept the knife in a grasp that made the bone handle a part of him. He did not rush, because silence is made of slowness. The towel became a seal, the hand became a weight, and the edge became a line that met its mark without the flourish of cruelty and without the spectacle the mistress had required of others. He had chosen a method that used the kitchen's physics, not its poisons, because he wanted the body that had ordered the iron bit to learn what the world felt like without command of sound. The act was quick in the way a well-practiced cut is quick. It was not theatrical. The candle died on its own a breath later, snuffed by air and wax together. When he stood, the towel held what it needed to hold, and the only evidence of his passage was a flattened place on the mattress and a faint pattern of fibers that would later raise questions in the sheriff's mind. On the washstand, he set the iron bit, unwrapped and bare, a mirror held to a habit. He left as the house absorbed the change. The sash lifted and dropped softly, as if the room had taken a deeper breath. The chamber door eased back to its place. On the stairs, he met only the smell of laudanum cooling in a glass. On the pantry's threshold, the decoy keys still shone in their false authority, and the overseer's real ring lay where his coat would land when he came in from his circuit. Cato collected neither. He took only the towel and the blade, wrapped now in a second cloth that smelled of vinegar, the sour cut meant to keep metal from telling tales. The third set piece lived in the yard's middle, where the chapel bell hung like a dark fruit from its beam. Garrick Howe's lantern swung wide as he rounded the kennel, a sweep that threw thin bone shadows of pickets across the ground. The dogs hit the grease trail and pulled, noses down, tails high, drawing lines toward the tar yard with conviction that would read like knowledge to a man who trusted dogs more than he trusted people. Howe frowned into the rain-laced light and struck the bell as if to test whether it still obeyed him. The cracked clapper delivered a fat, short note that died too soon. He struck again, impatient, then again, until the sound made itself obvious even to him. Something in the metal had changed. Worry chased drink from his face, and he moved faster than his key hand could settle, scooping the decoy ring from its hook without looking. The gesture of a man whose body solves tasks his mind has not yet attended to. That was the intended hinge. With false keys in pocket and dogs committed to a scent that led into pitch and shavings, Howe would be a man busy with the wrong problems. But the sky, which had given a little light a minute before, now opened a wider seam. A white wash rolled over the yard, and in it a neighbor's skiff showed as a shadow beyond the landing. The poacher stood to set a net, and, in standing, made a figure where no figure should be at that hour. He was nobody's lookout, but his habit of looking by habit meant his eyes raked the gallery and found a movement not on his list. A man crossing from pantry to smokehouse with a bundle he should not have at that time. Countermove made, adaptation followed. Cato did not run for the quarter or out toward the bend. He walked the short line to the smokehouse and let himself in with the same small language the lock already knew. Inside, he found the tub of ash and plunged the towel and rag in, pressing until the gray sludge closed over cloth and steel like a lid. He lifted the paring knife, now filmed and dull to sight, and slid it into a seam between crocks where fat would later coat it until someone reached for bacon and found a question instead. The towel, weight changed by ash, went into a sack with hog bristles used for brushes. He set the sack on a shelf, neither hidden nor displayed, a future confusion sitting in plain sight. Outside, the neighbor shifted his stance and returned to his nets, satisfied that he had seen nothing worth the risk of speaking. The overseer, meanwhile, discovered the decoy key's unhelpfulness at the granary door, cursed a breath into the rain, and went to the kennel to fetch a second ring from a hook he kept hidden behind the feed bucket. In that delay, Dinah came along the gallery again, this time with a basin that slopped once and did not slop again, and the path between house and smokehouse returned to looking like a path walked only for the reasons it is always walked. The fourth set piece drew Cato away from structures to the ground itself. He moved to the fig tree and knelt where the child's bowl of earth had made a shallow depression over weeks of play. With a palm, he spread damp soil across his palms and the tops of his feet, then walked the fence line where pitch seep had made the ground soft. He stepped in the places where hog prints crossed his, borrowing the geometry of another body to confuse a nose, and a man who read sign only as a series of isolated facts. He did not head for the river. He headed for the low swale behind the tar yard where rainwater collected, and he stood there up to his calves until the chill climbed his shins and taught his bones the patience he would need later. When he stepped out, the water took his scent as if it were a loose thread. Objective achieved. He left the yard as a question rather than a line. Behind him, the house discovered itself. A servant found the mistress, not by sound but by the absence of sound, and the sight of the iron bit where no one had left it. The first movements inside were frantic and contradictory. Towels fetched and dropped, laudanum lifted as if it could be poured backward to undo time. Bells struck in sequences that carried no meaning. The chapel bell gave that poor tone, the crack now a voice, and it told the yard the thing Cato had planned for it to tell, that fear had moved into the big house and taken a room. The irreversible moment arrived not with fire or gunshot, but with a chain of small consequences that could not be reversed by any single gesture. By the time Garrick Howe sorted his rings and brought the right key to the store of bandages and wine, a portion of the yard had already run the wrong directions and spent itself. By the time he sent a man to loose the dogs from their false business, those dogs had rolled in tar and ash and made themselves useless. By the time a rider left for the colonel with a message that tried to say what had happened without saying it, the river had taken the rider's reflection and shaken it into something unsteady. Cato did what a plan built from tools and physics demands in its final shape. He left the property not by the river or the road, but by the seam between them, a line of willow and vine that led into swamp dark where even a lantern looks like a midge. He carried nothing that could accuse him except the smell of vinegar on his skin, and even that the rain worked to erase. At the bend, where the neighbor kept his nets, he paused long enough to listen to the water make its small tapping against a skiff side, a sound he had known since boyhood. He did not take the boat. Boats make wakes and wakes write signatures. He took instead the cypress knees like stepping stones, and put his feet where water and wood together teach a body to balance. Behind him, the chapel bell rang again and again, its cracked note counting something no one could name. Akamai in the pantry, the ledger waited with its last strange entries and its abrupt crossing out. In the smokehouse, a blade slept under fat and ash. Under the fig tree, the small bowl of earth filled with rain until its surface lay flat and reflective as a plate. The network that had carried him through the yard. Children who could count echoes, an old man with a stick, a girl with a basin, a neighbor who saw by habit, did what networks do when a plan resolves. It returned to ordinary shapes that do not draw a pointing finger. The house had changed in a way that would reach into mourning and into law. Whatever came next would unfold in rooms with shutters pulled half, under a bell that refused to sing properly, along a river that would carry rumors faster than boats. The act itself had been silent, but its consequences were already loud in the places that measured power by ledgers and keys. The structure of the estate's control had taken a cut it could not stitch without leaving a scar. The escape had been committed, and the yard would not go back to what it was before, no matter how many times the bell was struck. At first light after the storm, the house presented itself like a diagram with pieces shifted out of place. The sash in the mistress's chamber stood lifted a hand's breadth. The washstand candle lay a small lake of congealed wax. The iron bit rested unwrapped on polished wood where it did not belong. The bed showed a hollow, where a body had turned toward the window and met a quiet that had weight. A kitchen towel, one of the coarse ones too worn for bathing, was missing from its peg. The pantry ledger waited with its last odd entries, then a violent crossout that broke through the paper. When Garrick Howe forced order onto chaos by striking the chapel bell, the cracked clapper produced that thick, short tone again, as if the metal refused to lie about what had happened. Household discovery took the shape of movement without words. Water was fetched and then set aside. Laudanum was lifted as if a measure could be poured back in time. A shawl appeared where a shawl did not matter. A servant, whose days seldom reached the upper gallery, found the iron bit where it watched from the washstand and stared at it the way a person stares at a snake in winter. The overseer pulled keys, wrong ones first, then right ones, and opened the cupboard where bandages lived among bottles. No one touched the ledger. It had become an accusation simply by being in order. By mid-morning, the sheriff had crossed from the nearest seat of authority with a constable and 2 militiamen who were more spectacle than help. The docket that survived in the folio later, dated the 13th day of August, 1719, describes the scene in a tone so level it reads like ice. A chamber with sash raised for air. A candle guttered on the stand, a towel stained in a manner consistent with a wound to the mouth. A restraint device of iron present on a shelf within reach. No signs of forced entry at windows or doors. Lantern patterns on the gallery consistent with a patrol interrupted by rain and drink. Dogs unusable due to contamination by tar and ash. The writing makes a point of the usable and the unusable, as if the difference were a kind of guilt. The sheriff measured by hand spans where he could not carry a scale. He counted time by candle stub and laudanum dregs and the cooling rate of a wash basin that had held boiled cloth. He made a note about the paring blades, one present at its post, one absent, one dulled beyond kitchen use by ash and grease. He lifted his gaze to the pantry shelf and paused at the ledger. The string count of rags, oil, and salt across weeks read like music, and then stopped with a scraped line that tore the paper. He wrote that down too. He stood under the bell and struck it once, then once again, and observed the pitch as if the bell were a witness with a damaged mouth. He walked the yard and found grease dragged to the tar shavings, a trick any man who had worked livestock could admire, and any man who worshipped order would resent. By evening, the house's quiet had developed contour. The mistress breathed but did not speak. Fever thickened behind the rose oil, and the body that had insisted on silence learned its own silence without command. She lived that day and the next, and then died on the 3rd morning, trailed by the scent of laudanum and the residual brightness of polished iron. The inquest assembled in the great room, shutters half drawn against heat and talk. The constable placed the iron bit on a table as if it were an ordinary household object and not a theology. The sheriff recorded distances in phrases, within arm's reach, a few steps at the foot of the bed, because the room's measures were not built for the kind of mathematics the moment demanded. The overseer's account belonged to the weather of habit. Patrols made, dogs stirred. A bell struck in proper sequence, then malfunctions, false keys, tar-slick hounds, a kitchen towel missing, a pantry ledger misbehaving in ink. His paper carried a phrase that colonial records used when a thing did not fit boxes but demanded to be put somewhere. Domestic tumult. Another phrase edged around intent without naming it. Injury by person or persons unknown, likely within the household. The law's language refused to say slave for the doer and mistress for the done to. It wrote over both with words that made a private act into a public category. In doing so, it made the house sound reasonable, and the wound sound abstract. Witnesses placed themselves carefully on paper. Dinah recited the routine of water and galleries in a way that made sound into a proof. Isaac appeared in his usual way, quietly, and stood his stick against his leg until the sheriff tired of waiting for the moment when confusion would reveal more than clarity. The neighbor with the skiff came reluctantly when summoned, and described a figure crossing gallery to smokehouse. A bundle carried nothing more. He did not know faces that far. He knew movement at that hour was not common. He knew nets and tides better than he knew people's business at rich houses. The sheriff wrote his words into the ledger of the moment and reduced them to a line about a possible sighting. The neighbor would return to his bend and let the river carry whatever it wished. Search lines pushed out from the estate as far as courage would take them before Swamp began to teach its own maps. Militia prints cut the road for a while and then dissolved into willow shade. Dogs, finally cleaned of pitch, lost the scent at the swale where rain had pooled, then cast in circles that solved nothing. The overseer marched the quarter into the yard and counted bodies as if counting could reassert what had slipped. A straw pallet stood empty where Cato Mayfield had slept. Beneath the pallet lay a scrap of cloth stiff with a mix of ash and fat. The alchemy of a whetstone well tended. The smokehouse shelves bore a sack with hog bristles, and beneath it, a smear the color of slate. Further in, between crocks, a diner's hand later would find a paring blade caked hard as if it had slept inside winter. That discovery would come weeks after the papers closed. A small shock in an ordinary morning. Rumor ran faster than men on horseback. Downriver, the story became the hand of silence who walked on cypress knees and left no prints. Upriver, it became a warning to household heads about open windows and cracked bells and kitchen knives too carefully maintained. In town, at the smithy, the man who had made the bit wrapped it in cloth as if to keep from seeing it when a new order came in, and when he spoke at market he called the whole business an affliction, the kind of euphemism that lets a man sleep. He did not say instrument, though instrument would have been true. He did not say faith, though faith would have been truer. The law did what law does when confronted with a challenge it would rather not name. The precinct issued a notice that knives in kitchens were to be counted at dusk and dawn by white hands alone. Movement after the bell would narrow to paths from quarter to kiln and quarter to field. Keys would be centralized. Windows would be latched earlier on nights when heat argued otherwise. The iron bit, listed in the inventory as a restraint for insolence, remained on the ledger as property, not as evidence. The inquest declared the death a consequence of felonious assault by person or persons unknown and bound over the overseer to better diligence. The phrase satisfied paper. It satisfied no one who had stood in the room and watched the air fail to carry a voice. As for Cato Mayfield, the record breaks just where the river widens. One account traced him toward the green swamp beyond Town Creek, a place that takes sound and returns it changed. Another placed him with watermen for a season, quiet in the bow, while oars carved small truths into the Cape Fear. A merchant said much later that a cooper upriver trained a man with a steady hand for edges and hoops, a man who did not speak much and who touched a knot at hip height when he passed a fig tree. None of those lines end with a capture or a trial or a scaffold. They end in the way such lines often end in that time and that ground. The person becomes a habit in a landscape, then a rumor in a work song, then a superstition about bells that ring flat in wet weather. The estate learned from the wound in the manner of places that cannot admit they have learned. Knives went into locked drawers. Stones were issued only under eye. Grease rags were counted as if cloth could be a wall. Children were kept from the fig tree when fruit set, as if wasps and secrets could be managed by edict. The chapel bell kept ringing, each strike a reminder that metal carries its memory forward. When the master returned from a trip that the ledger called necessary and the house called convenient, his saber on the table looked more decorative than decisive. His militia friends came and stared hard at sills and hinges and said things about vigilance and providence that did not move the cracked clapper any closer to whole. In the months that followed, a small discipline took root in kitchens up and down the river. Stones were not to be oiled after sundown. Windows were to be lowered by a measure at the first sound of frogs. Ledgers began to carry notations about rags and salt with a new exactness that betrayed fear masquerading as thrift. Some households copied the Whitfield practice of keeping a decoy ring visible while the true ring hid elsewhere, not realizing that such duplicity teaches everyone who lives within it to read authority as theater. The iron bit, in some houses, disappeared into trunks. In others, it acquired a new rag, cleaner and thicker, as if better wrapping could make better sense. The echo took on a tune. River hands sang in low voices about a bell with a broken mouth that told on masters as well as on those they held. Women at wash spread gossip like sheets, each line catching wind and then calming, leaving behind a crease that marked memory. In the quarter, elders told children to listen for the difference between a tool and a weapon, for sometimes the thing itself does not change, but the way a hand meets it does. Some said a man had gone into the green and learned to be part of it. Others said the green had taken him and kept him alive. Still, others said nothing and let silence be the shape of respect. Long years later, in Raleigh, the box came out of the climate and into the light. The folio with its stiffened cord, the iron key tied to it, the pressed magnolia petal veined brown, the ledger smelling faintly of smoke. All of it sat under a reader's lamp while a modern archivist turned pages with gloved hands. On one sheet, the sheriff's script ran narrow and dry. On another, the household accounts marched in tidy columns until the week when oil and rags rose by small, regular measures and then stopped with a stroke that scarred the page. The crack in the chapel bell existed in those lines, not as sound, but as an absence of duration. A note about a paring knife found months later between crocks had been added in a different ink. A memory folded into record. What law called domestic tumult reads now like a ledger of revenge set in the units of a household. Cloths, stones, grease, keys, a bent lock tongue, a cracked bell, a habit of touching a knot on a fig tree. The evidence tells a method and a motive without theatrics. It shows a wound that reaches backward to an iron device and forward to a set of rules that tried to keep kitchens from being classrooms. It leaves the outcome where it belongs. A body quieted by what it had ordered for others. A man walking away carrying nothing but a discipline he had long practiced. A yard that would never again trust the sound of its own bell. In the reading room, the archivist closed the ledger and retied the cord. The iron key did not open anything anymore. The magnolia petal, foxed and fragile, kept its shape against the paper. The smell of old smoke rose when the box was lifted. The bell itself is not in the box. It hangs in no museum known to the records. But when the room is very quiet and the page where the crossout scarred the paper is held at an angle, the light shows the torn fibers like a line of tiny mouths. The ledger that once kept count of salt and rags has become the thing that remembers. And in that memory, the bell's cracked note rings again, short and heavy, carrying the story forward in a language no law could smooth.